Welcome to the ninth episode of our Safety First podcast. And today we are going to talk about a topic on heat stress. I know it's very hot of late, so this is why we bring this episode to you. And today we are going to interview someone very special and someone that has the qualifications to tell us all about this. Our guest is Associate Professor Jason Lee. He is the Director of the Heat Resilience and Performance Center at Yong Lu Lin School of Medicine at the National University of Singapore. His research focuses on fluid balance, thermoregulation, and strategies to improve human performance in heat stress conditions. He also studies physiological demands and adaptations of the human body under passive and exertional heat stress to optimize performance and survival. Yeah, and together with me is also my co-host Kajol with us in this episode.
Dr. Jason, it's so nice of you to join us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Hi, Dr. Jason. Welcome to the podcast. Maybe you can just give a quick introduction. I know I use a lot of big words there that I can barely pronounce. So, in short, can you tell us who you are and what you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
I'm a researcher predominantly, so I undertake thermal physiology research with the aim, especially in today's world, right? Everyone is feeling the heat. So I just want to help using research to augment the ability for human, not just to survive, but to thrive in a warming environment. We know there's a separate arm of this carbon mitigation. As I always say, that will take time. Even we stop the carbon emissions, it won't happen overnight that we go back to a cooler world. So humans need to continue to survive, and therefore you can say we are buying time. Hopefully that will happen, but in the meantime, the humans still need to work and survive in a hot environment.
Yeah, hopefully we are all melting in this heat.
Let's go into the heat now. Like, you handle heat stress, you talk about it all the time. I see some interesting posters behind you as well. So what is heat stress and how is it defined in the context of workplace safety?
Heat stress broadly comprises three parts. The environment, how hot, how humid, whether there is sun, whether there's wind. So there's the environment component. There's also the attire, what kind of clothing you are donning. But more importantly, it's also about the work demands and the type of work that you undertake, whether it is by piece, means that you are being paid based on how much work you do. This is important, right? Because this is, imagine now you are being paid by piece. You will somehow disregard even when it's hot because you need to earn. As compared to a context where you are being paid by time. It's okay, as long as I hang here as long as possible, I will still be paid the usual amount. And then the costs automatically get transferred to the employer because they are not getting the most out of you because you are just there. We call it presentism. So yeah, it's largely determined by the environment, the attire, and also the type of work that you are undertaking. This is critical because we cannot assume the hotter it is, it will always become more dangerous. Because we keep on saying that it's as if that when it's not so hot, it is safe. Not true. When it is not so hot but not very cool, human can work very hard. But there's a component about you producing heat. So the third component, which is, as I said, besides the attire environment, the exercise or the work demand is actually key in determining your resultant heat strain. So here without heat stress, you can see heat stress is all the factors that will result in heat strain. Actually, we are more worried about heat strain, not all about heat stress. Likewise, when you cool an environment, like in this day, we like to overcool the whole building. Actually, you think about it, we want to cool the human and not to cool the whole building for the sake of it. That's where a lot of energy is being wasted.
Wow. And I didn't know about this term called heat strain before. I always like, heat stress, heat stress. With this heat strain, right, can I say like heat strain is also a very broad topic that not many know about?
Yeah, I mean, first between heat stress and heat strain, we first need to decipher between or ascertain what are the definition, because often they are used interchangeably. But loosely, you can say heat stress is one of the factors that will result in a hot body, which is heat strain. And yes, it is important because now we actually not just worry about hot environment, it's how the hot environment affects the body, which is the heat strain. Then we can start to think, okay, the aim is not to get the body hot. Besides the environment, I can alter the work, I can alter my attire accordingly. Of course, on the other hand, right, because subsequently we'll talk about can we monitor body, the environmental temperature to regulate our work. I think that works well in the context where you are almost sure the other two components are affixed. Means that, okay, for whatever reason, the attire I can't change. This is the work attire, it's always going to be there. Then you say, for whatever reason, this is the work rate, we won't change the work profile. Means the workers have little behavior alterations. So if the two components are fixed, right, yes, then the assumption is the hotter it gets, then the hotter your body will become. Then you can argue maybe in that context, I just need to put the environmental monitor. It can regulate my work. But in another context where that human has free choice to alter their work profile, right? In fact, you might even argue when it gets very, very hot, right? Sometimes it can be very, very safe because the extreme limit of very hot is people stop work altogether, or the employers start to put in all their enforcement because it's too hot. There's a lot of awareness, there's a lot of measures, so it can be very safe. So while a warming environment is important, we shouldn't assume the current or the environment we experienced years back are perfectly well. We're already in that zone, especially in this part of the world. Our leeway is very little. Every 1 or 2 degrees increase, we do feel it. Once you can feel the heat, usually what it means is your behavior will be affected. Most of the time is for the better. I know you will protect yourself. You say, I'm not going to go out because it is way too hot. But there are implications. That means work productivity will suffer accordingly.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I think that there are a lot of risk factors when you're working under heat stress or heat strain, as you say. So what are actually the common risk factors or conditions that can contribute to heat stress in the workplace?
Yeah, there are external, extrinsic and intrinsic factors. The extrinsic from the environment, maybe poor ventilation, the attire you are being imposed to don, let's say in the factory. As I say, the nature of work that you undertake, whether you are a delivery man where it's by piece and therefore you will disregard the harsher environment, or you are construction workers where you are paid by time and therefore there will be a lot of presenteeism. Those external factors will affect how you work. From a personal factors, the level of fitness, the level of heat acclimatization, whether you are sick on that day, and that there are still a lot of elderly workers or older workers that sometimes they have diseases and therefore will be supplemented with medications. Little is known in that area, but we know some of these medications could potentially further compromise their ability to lose heat. Also, these are some of the key factors that might present you at a higher risk, when you're exposed to heat. And it's not like today you are good means tomorrow you are good. Like any of these factors go haywire that day, that means you could caught a bug and you are sick, right? You will suddenly put you at very high risk, even though the heat stress or the degree of heat stress is the same tomorrow. So it's almost like you want to monitor that conditions, continuously. I don't assume he was okay last week in this condition means this week it is okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. We have talked to a few solution providers out there about this. And I think there was one, or it's an upcoming solution provider that also shared with us about how they have to do like health screening, like just a temperature check plus BP check every day. Even though yesterday he was fine, right? Today he might be suffering from something else. So I'm not very sure if that's the way to go in the future. Do you think that's ideal for work sites, especially construction sites that haven't had shade yet, to have this in place so that we can make sure that the heat strain is being monitored as well?
Yeah, ideally, yes, you want to monitor the heat strain real time continuously. But before we have that, because easy to say, right? And say how much does those things cost and we can't afford, that cannot be implemented. But the usual stuff we are doing or recommended to do are important stuff. Again, if I simplified it, just a simple health check. If you're unwell, right, and finally you're unwell, and then you get exposed to heat. And when you get hot, right, what it means is, let's say you're unwell, your capacity is already limited. You're just creating a strain for your body, because when you get hot, the first thing is your skin blood flow will increase because you want to push the heat to the side and be transferred accordingly. And I'll just see it from a limited blood volume perspective. Now there's this competition between the blood, therefore the oxygens have to supply your vital organs. Now you get hot, the same limited pool of blood have to be circulated or pushed to the skin for heat dissipation. So you are competing the limited blood, therefore oxygens or nutrients between two sides now. If it's not hot, all the blood can be perfusing your organs. While you're hot, there's competition, and therefore your heart rate will increase, right? Because you need to pump the blood to please both sides. But if you're somebody very frail because you're sick, or you're sick in the first place, or you're just unwell, if you're unwell then unfit, that is the double whammy. So you have very little leeway to appease these two parts of the organ, which is your vital organs versus your skin. At some point, you might collapse. And then sometimes it's indirect, like the usual heat waves that we hear from time to time every summer. It's not what we imagine. These elderly sit in the living room and they get cooked to death. A lot of times they have existing conditions. Sometimes medication could make it worse. And you are just perturbating the limited cardiovascular capacity, straining the system, and therefore he might feel lightheaded, he collapse, maybe something sharp, there is no things of keen, and then it pass on accordingly. And so loosely we say, if you're well, you get hot, it's fine. If you're unwell, you get hot, you're in trouble.
But I bet that there are some early signs, right? You can tell, because sometimes when we are working under heat, we don't know what are the signs that we should look out for. Yeah. So what do you think are the early signs or symptoms that workers should look out for when they're working under heat stress?
Yeah, and then before I go to signs, right, you probably commonly hear this continuum of heat illnesses. They say it commences with heat syncope, means lightheadedness, then you progress to heat cramps, then you get heat exhaustion, and then you get heat stroke. While that's been said and repeated a million times, in my opinion, there is no hard evidence to support that. There's only one heat illness in this four that I just described, which is heat stroke. Very well documented. You can diagnose it. If you challenge the notion of heat cramps, why somebody call it heat cramps? You do get cramps in cold weather, but how come we don't call it cold cramps? You do get exhausted in the cold, so we work very hard, right? But we don't call it cold exhaustion. We call it heat exhaustion. So be careful, because eventually we'll say, what is the one thing I would advocate to beat the heat is, I would say you need to train hard and keep yourself aerobically fit. And also the heat syncope, the cramps, the exhaustion, in my opinion, are severity of symptoms to pick up before potentially you get heat stroke. And heat stroke, in this context, we are confining within the occupational, so largely is exertional heat stroke. Usually happen in healthy individuals who are motivated, that produce a lot of heat and then overproduce heat. The other kind is a classic or passive heat stroke. Those are usually manifested in infants. Remember, all times you see the baby get kept in the car because the dad or mom went for grocery shopping, forget the baby, and the summer came. Or the elderly during heat waves, because they have very little mobility to move around in face of heat waves.
Also, I just wanted to mention that you talked about construction workers where they have to continuously work under heat. What kind of effective strategies or measures that employers can take to help them?
Yeah, if you can, from an employer perspective, right, do whatever you can to augment the environment. Because the problem, in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with aircon per se. What is wrong is people who need aircon are not given aircons. People who don't need aircons are abusing aircons. So the problem is the allocation of resources. So let's say in extreme case, like old folks home, the very hot places, got elderly, high-risk nurses serving them, right? I think why not having aircon in that place, those kind of contexts. But coming back to your question, right? It could be a supplementation of aircon and fans. Let's say you have the aircon as an option. So it's not 1 or 0 all the time. It could be turn out the temperature so you don't overuse the energy and supplement it with fan. So instead of 22 degrees aircon, it could be 25, 26, but you turn on the fan. But let's say you don't have aircon, then the design of the workplace with fans, ventilations, with shade, if you are construction workers, all this will do wonders from an engineering control perspective. That means provide the best. But at some point, you can say I optimize all my work conditions. Still, my workers are feeling hot. Then that's where now you look at from a personal perspective, what could you do? Number one, always start with optimizing work rest cycle. That means this is the work I'm going to do. I know if I continue to work, I will hit the threshold, then I will stop. Not only I predispose myself at high risk, I will curtail work prematurely because once I get very hot, I will stop. No more work. I won't be, worst case, admitted to the hospital. I'll say I'll take a day break. And that's why it's very common, right? We have work rest cycle. You work certain hour, you rest, then you work. There's a whole principle. Before you feel it, you rest first, then you start. Because when you start, you don't start based on baseline. At some point, you will still get very tired. But there's good evidence to suggest, besides optimizing work rest cycle, you should really fortify the human, just by keeping yourself fit. Goes a very long way. You'll find that a very fit individual is also one who can tolerate heat. Basically, going back to my earlier point, you just have a greater capacity. Heat is just one stressor, it's just stressing your body. If your capacity is huge, you can welcome that additional stressor. Besides getting yourself aerobically fit, right, you should also get the workers heat acclimatized. Again, sometimes the employers say, no, a lot of these workers are migrant workers, right? And I'll say, no, I pay for them, so day one, they could work the 8 hours for me, man, too bad, because I pay for them. So it's very, very acute, they want to get the most out of them. But we are saying, no, you want to have a longer runway and reduce the risk, right? You should progressively expose them to the work condition. Maybe first week, you just work 4 hours, then the other 4 hours you do more low intensity work. Let them acclimatize, because this will go a very long way. Let's say for a Chinese worker, northern part of China, you recruited him to work in Singapore or Malaysia or Thailand, and that sudden change in temperature, they might not have time to get accustomed. Therefore, in a cool environment, usually you are more productive. You can work at a higher pace. So they've been doing that for a longest time, where they then suddenly come to the tropics. Their body, there's a lag, they still work at that pace, and therefore they produce a lot of heat. So heat acclimatization is important. Then after that, cooling, maybe pre-cooling, during cooling, when they are in the shade, supplement with fan. Recently, we test out the use of giving ice slushy, ice slurry. Maybe most of us know it as ice slurpee in the 7-Eleven that we have. But not getting kind of content, those are very high in sugar. So take a sports drink, put inside an ice slurry machine. The science of that is because ice, when being melted to water, right, your body needs to give away a lot of heat. So you are literally cooling your body if you drink some fine ice. Then of course the most popular of the strategy you can consider is hydration. I said it the last, but I tell you most people put it as a first. They always say hot, no problem, just drink as much as possible. We don't advocate that because we have seen sometimes people, we have seen before people overhydrate because they thought that is their only tool to beat the heat. So usually I drink 2 cups, but how whether I just drink 10 cups? You can dilute your blood concentration, and that itself is a problem. So these are the things you can do. You can also use other behavioral strategy, like having a buddy to look out for you. Usually when you are in trouble, right, you don't know you're in trouble. So somebody say you are like, not your usual self. Maybe I should sound off to the boss. Then techniques like environmental monitoring. I said earlier, if your tire at work is pretty much fixed, yes, you can assume higher temperature is higher risk. Then, of course, for those who are more resourceful, physiological monitoring can be considered. But the key message here is the solutions must be contextualized. So look at the problems first and find something that works in the environment.
Yeah, I think not just the construction site, we also face the heat as we walk on the streets. I'm not sure, there are some cooling sprays that are sold in pharmacies. I'm not sure what the side effects are if these cooling sprays are used, because personally I use it when I go out on the street. I'll just spray some and go out the house. I'm not sure if it's a possible solution for the construction site as well. What do you think?
Yeah, the short answer is no, and a big no. I think in your context, you correctly say if you are sure, okay, like your context, average person walking in the street, those are just pure thermal discomfort. You're almost sure that my body is not boiling inside because I'm not working hard. I'm just walking. It's pure thermal comfort. Basically, what it does is you spray, and then you make your skin a bit wet, and the wind, right, it promotes evaporation. So it gives you the sensation that you feel, oh, there's a cooling, almost like menthol kind of effect. But this can become very dangerous in the construction because they are exertional workers. We know they are building heat internally. So that when we know when the human has a chance of building heat internally, right, you want the person to know when they are hot, and therefore actions or behavior will change. It can become very dangerous when the person is boiling internally and you're bluffing him externally. And in that case, when you're working, right, your sweat usually is functioning. And your sweat does not lose heat. No, sweating does not lose heat. Sweat evaporation loses heat. And therefore, if you have those mists when they are working, you are just making the environment more saturated and limiting the ability for the sweats to be evaporated. So in fact, in that context, we strongly discourage the use of this misting. This misting is best, let's say, even for the elderly, where we have data to suggest they don't sweat as well. So you can see the mist is like their artificial sweats. But in the exertional context, maybe the soldiers, firefighters, workers, we wouldn't want to recommend those.
Yeah, because I think that's a very available solution. We went to exhibitions and there are cooling sprays, and at the exhibition you are not at the construction site, right? So when they spray it and you feel good, then you're like, yeah, maybe I can use it at the construction site.
You're right. Exhibition, I presume, usually is aircon, humidity is lower. So when you spray something, you almost get evaporated. It's almost like the menthol effect. I feel good. But try spraying on those things in the construction site. All they get at best is the acute sensation. After that, they say, I'm really very damp and wet. You're still spraying more mist on me. I just feel more uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's very well covered. But I think on the other hand, you also mentioned a lot about severe heat stress and it causes heat stroke, right? So if let's say you really saw someone fainted outside, what are the emergency procedures that we can take if we see any of these happen at the work site?
Yeah, I think if all the preventive stuff we talk about, that should, if they cross the line, they get heat injury, in this case, heat stroke. And it must be clear, if it's exhaustion, usually recovery is fine, cool blaze, hydrate. But if it heat stroke, right, the key principle is you need to cool the person as aggressively as possible. Just remember this slogan or mantra means cool and dash. Don't just dash. Let's say, no, when you are heat stroke, then I want to send to the hospital. Often that is the mistake. Sounds very logical because hospital knows it best. But the journey to the hospital when a person is not cool, that's where the damage is done. So aggressive cooling is a must. Cold water immersion is a gold standard. But I know in many workplaces, we don't have that because it's hard to maintain a cold water immersion. But dousing them with water, just find ways, whatever means you have, put ice on them, fan them, get the ventilation. But the key principle is do whatever you can to bring down the body temperature at the spots. And you are sure when the person is having a heat stroke, when you find that his mental status is being compromised. So ask what is his phone number, where does he live, he struggles to remember those, or he's walking wobbly like a drunken man, right? You can assume that he's having heat stroke, and then you must cool him as aggressively as possible.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this as well. Is there any specific training programs or resources available for workers and employers to educate them about heat stress prevention and management, especially in their workplace? Do they offer such seminars or trainings?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak, from my lens here. In Singapore here, our workplace safety and health council has a good set of guidelines for occupational heat management. From time to time, they will organize seminars to proliferate the key points. And recently, we had a whole seminar just dedicated on heat management. In my capacity at the university, we also run a 3-day workshop, on occupational periodization, teaching them how to get ready for their work requirements, and also heat management. What kind of strategies? Some of which I talk about. How can you fortify or heat-proof a worker? In our case, could be a firefighter or a law enforcer. So we do have that within my purview. There are a lot of good resources out there too. But there's also a lot of myths, one of which I think Amanda said, hey, those kind of myths, can we use it? The answer is no. But there are a lot more. Some people say that we should hydrate as much as possible. And recently I heard there was a headline news saying that when you're hot, you should drink something hot. See, those are things that we have to debunk. Those are not very well supported by evidence. I can only imagine in a very dry environment where you can't sweat, or you want to maximize your ability to sweat every single drip of sweat. Maybe the argument, it makes sense, but in our environment, right, and the occupation, when you are done with layers, I would struggle to think that you need anything to promote more sweat, because usually you are over sweating. So yeah, my main point is there are still, while we got about educating the employers and the workers, right, the intendant, we're also spending a lot of efforts to debunk or unlearn. As you probably agree, sometimes it's easy to learn new things, but it's harder to unlearn old things. So the latter proves to be the more challenging part. So be careful what you read out there. Sometimes when someone say a sentence, then 1,000 repeated, that sentence could become like a fact, or like 8 glasses of water a day. Those are just saying or apple a day, it sounds very, very nice, but there's no evidence to support those.
Yeah, I totally agree. 8 glasses a day. Not every time it applies, I think. Actually, just now you mentioned about cooling the person if the person is suffering from a heat stroke. So assuming that the company has monitored the stress level from time to time, but how do they actually monitor this heat stress? Is there any equipment or tools that they should have in place to combat this heat stress that we are talking about here?
Yeah, minimally, right? And again, with the assumption the tire and the work profile will be the same. I think a climatic logger or monitoring tool is something we can strongly advise. That's equipment to represent the heat stress experience at the work site. Some may say, I can call my weather station. Bear in mind, those sensors that's planted by the weather stations can be very far away from your work site, so are not representative. But if you can, let's say now you are a more resourced company, you can provide wearables. Now you are not measuring heat stress, you are measuring in a way heat strain. You might not bet the internal core temperature, but even heart rates. When you're hot, usually your heart rates will increase. So imagine with me, you have 100 guys exposed in the same condition, but a few guys have heart rate that is beating very high. They immediately allow you to zoom in and say, hey, let's pull those 3 individuals out. Likely they are suffering with this heat. So these are the 2 forms from an environment perspective to account for heat stress. But I think the way ahead is personalized monitoring.
Wow. Before we end, I just want to know, are there any long-term effects associated with recurrent or prolonged exposure to heat stress?
Yeah, that's a good one because traditionally we think that if I don't get heat stroke means okay. But new evidence seems to suggest chronic exposure to moderate heat stress itself can also be a problem. I think one of the first findings of such was profiled in agriculture sector, Central America, sugarcane cutters. Also in the past, they found there's this high incidence or prevalence of chronic kidney disease. So this young man passed on early 40s, but for the longest time, they have attributed to the pesticides in the agriculture or the poor genes from where they came from. And in recent years, they did very simple comparative group, the workers and the supervisors. So basically the workers cut the cane, the supervisor just eye power at the sides, but didn't cut the cane. And immediately they say, hang on, the supervisors also have the same genes. They also at the work site, so they're also breathing in all the pesticide. So long story short, there's no problem, no health implication on the supervisors. but serious health implication in the form of chronic kidney disease in the workers. But the leading hypothesis at present seems to be this chronic accumulation of heat. So that's one, but as I said earlier, sometimes it's an indirect impact because for us, now not for the workers, we are paying the price sometimes indirectly. In a cooler climate, they tell you I don't have the deliberate time to go and run because every day I walk or cycle to work. I can do that because it's comfortable. Those are my physical activity count. In our part of the world, we don't do that. Like every physical activity is almost very deliberate, must proportion time to exercise. So what it means, if you sleep late and you have OT at night, then you don't have comfortable window out there to exercise. Another example is I was told that these days, 9 out of 10 children in our part of the world are wearing spectacles. And there is evidence to prove that it's partly due to lack of outdoor exposure. So we don't have the vitamin D inducing the dopamine in the eyes, and therefore our eye health is being compromised. So as a society, we think that eye disease at 10-year-old is okay. But it's not okay because the more people who are myopic since young, at the age, there's a higher chance they might even get blind or eye illness as they age. I'd like to sum up by saying that the best analogy to describe us, we are the boiling frogs. We are being cooked very slowly to death, but we are still smiling, saying that it's okay, a bit uncomfortable, but no problem. It was always hot, still hot, a bit hotter. So what's the big fuss? But every summer, this time we will complain, hey, it's a bit hot. But you ask your climate agency, it's actually not very hot, just a couple of degrees higher. But it shows that our leeway is getting tighter and tighter. Any more slight increase will have implications.
Just to wrap up this round, any words you want to tell safety professionals or employers out there on what we have discussed today about heat stress?
To the employers, the investment in heat measures, is not just about providing welfare to the workers, and therefore we are immediately talking about compromise in the economics part. It means the work productivity, because that matters to the worker. Every dollar you invest to relieve heat strain or create welfare for the worker not only will protect them against potential health implication, it will also enhance work productivity and also reduce thermal comfort, and therefore leading to a reduced possibility of accidents. Also, it's not a zero-sum game. So we have to eradicate the mindset that offering welfare to the workers, relieving thermal discomfort or strain will compromise the business. The happy worker will only result in a more prosperous business.
Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Jason. Before we conclude today's episode on heat stress, we'd like to emphasize the importance of taking care of yourself and others during extreme heat conditions. As we discuss the risks and prevention measures, remember that your health and safety comes first. Thank you for tuning in and being a part of the Safety First podcast. Stay cool and stay safe. This is Kajol.
And I'm Amanda, and we're signing off.